and welcome to our discussion today on the topic of natural capital and the financialisation of nature. My name is Alexandra Sadler. I'm currently completing my Masters in International Development at the University of Oxford, and have also been conducting research on natural capital investment from a policy perspective as a research assistant at the university. It's my absolute pleasure to be moderating this discussion today on the topic of natural capital. I'll start us off with a brief overview of what we'll be discussing, and then we'll introduce each of our panelists. So currently, the dominant political and economic framework is one that champions economic growth at the expense of human and environmental well-being. This is leading to the degradation of natural resources, which has reached dangerous levels and is threatening to bring about irreversible climate change and biodiversity loss. In response to this crisis of natural resource degradation, there's an increasing call amongst mainstream political and economic thinkers that in order to protect these natural resources, we must recognize nature as an asset, leading to the growing notion of natural capital. In this panel discussion, we'll discuss what natural capital is. We'll critically evaluate the logic that leads to the financialization of nature. We'll consider some of the implications of the natural capital framework and explore alternative ways of thinking about nature and its preservation, as well as asking where agroecology and regenerative agriculture fit in. For the remainder of this hour, I'll be posing questions to the panelists on these topics. This will be followed by an opportunity to ask additional questions to our panelists via a Zoom link that will be posted in the session, in the chat box later in the session. So with that, I would now like to introduce each of our panelists. Ian Rappel is a geographer and conservation ecologist. Formerly CEO of Gwent Wildlife Trust, he now works for the Emerging College for Real Farming and Food Culture and is also the Wales Development Manager for the National Association for Areas of Outstanding Natural Beauty. Ian is also a curriculum advisor to the Black Mountains College. Sarah Queblatin is a regenerative design strategist engaging in inclusive landscape leadership. She weaves together collective experiences in peace building, cultural heritage advocacy, environmental education, and humanitarian assistance, and co-founded Green Relief Initiative in the Philippines. She's passionate about designing for resilience and regeneration in disasters, displacement, and development. Professor John O'Neill is the director of the Political Economy Institute at the University of Manchester, having previously held posts at Lancaster University, the University of Sussex, and the University of Wales. He conducts research on political economy, philosophy, environmental policy, political theory, ethics, and the philosophy of science. Professor O'Neill has also published an essay entitled Life Beyond Capital, which provides a crucial critique of the mainstream logic of natural capital. So with that, we will launch into our discussion. So the first question I would like to ask our panelists is, what exactly is natural capital and why is it so prominent in public discourse today? Ian, would you like to kick us off on that one?
Okay, thanks very much. Nice, easy question at the beginning. So natural capital is a utilitarian attempt to assign monetary value to nature, basically. It's a process of economic abstraction, and in my view should be read at best as a metaphor. It attempts to assess the value of nature's units of species, habitats, ecosystems, and so on, either with reference to human labor equivalents, so for example, how much it would cost to engage in flood prevention if nature wasn't providing that service, that kind of thing, or as standalone valuations for phenomena that we don't yet financially value. So that could be individual species like an orchid or something like that. Natural capital does that through what I would call sort of unholy alliance of neoclassical and neoliberal economics. It takes the premise of neoclassical economics that markets dictate the value of phenomena in society, and it's very closely linked to Garrett Hardin's hypothesis that private property should be used and encouraged to regulate resource use, the so-called tragedy of the commons. Off the back of that, it prescribes neoliberal solutions to realize and activate those valuations. So that could be nature financialization, so in private investment in nature conservation or biodiversity offsetting, all those sorts of activities, and emphasizes markets and things like payments for ecosystem services and carbon offsetting and so on. So it's a means by which economists attempt to assign economic value to the living world and our interaction with the living world. And the most significant part is they then attempt to justify the actual activation of markets in these areas in order to what they believe is reap the benefits of that process.
Awesome, thank you so much. Sarah, do you have anything to add to that description that Ian provided? I think you're muted at the moment.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Good evening from my part of the world. It's very hard to define it from my experience working with indigenous communities, because maybe I'm not the best person to define it from an academic perspective or anything, but working with indigenous communities, it's I would say natural capital is how people value nature. And so what valuation they place in it for me is, how they perceive the value of nature. So it varies across tribes or groups, but from a broad indigenous perspective is a lot of them refer to nature in relationship to them as kin or a sacred value to them. So it's I would say from using the word capital might also be very hard to spring from as a definition, but I'd be careful to define it from that perspective where I sit or where I'm learning from the communities I work with. So at least maybe sharing that experience and perspective for now to help define it.
Thank you, Sarah. John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I can add a few things. I mean, the first thing I should say is I used to go for walks in woods and meadows and fields and by rivers with my friends and acquaintances. And now I get benefit streams from natural capital while improving my social capital. And and the kind of question you have is what's gone wrong when you start thinking of the world in that kind of way, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'll just echo a few points that Ian's made, but just kind of separate them out. I think there are, if you're thinking about environment, what's going on when we conceive of environmental goods as natural capital, I think there's 5 different claims that we can separate out. The first one is that you start with this idea that wetlands, woodlands, farmland, meadowlands, and so forth, other sites of biodiversity are assets which provide a benefit stream. So you have that initial kind of economic description of it. You've then got the idea that losses in one can be compensated in one area of biodiversity or what loss of wetland can be compensated by gain elsewhere. So you have an aggregate level that you keep. So it's related to kind of no net loss policies. So you try you even get this net gain, right? Yeah. The third one is the one that Ian mentioned, that you then can put a monetary price on that. The fourth, over and above that, is that you can then use a market like offset markets. So you can give, landowners or environmental organizations can gain credits for enhancing an area of nature. And then when developers destroy another area, that's supposed to compensate for the loss. And finally, once you've got a market and money, then you've got a financial stream, you've got a monetary stream, and there you can start then financializing. So you can treat it as a financial asset. And then you can then start using financial instruments like derivatives and so on to govern the risks. And we'll talk now why I spend my life being very skeptical about that. So that's the background. But I've also on the ground, it's hit me more and more when I'm been doing work on urban nature in Manchester and its importance for well-being of people. How often those kind of natural capital concepts are used, it now dominates policymaking, are used to justify the destruction of areas of nature that really matter to local communities under the guise that's going to be net gain or no net loss. But we can come back to the problems afterwards. So thanks very much.
Thank you for those responses. That was really insightful. And I guess kind of a follow-up question to that would be, what types of actors are promoting this idea of nature as capital? So John, you mentioned policymakers, and Ian had mentioned kind of neoliberal and neoclassical economics. Would you say those are kind of the primary actors who are using this type of discourse, or is it where is it coming from, I guess?
I mean, I would say both of those. It's coming from, but it's also coming from, I mean, a kind of attempt to create money and profits out of areas where there wasn't those before. So there's actual commercial agencies involved in this as well. The other really worrying thing, which I'll maybe come back to later on, is the degree to which a lot of nature organizations are bought into this. Right, yeah, and because once you have an offsetting regime, it actually becomes a source of income. So if I look at some Rio Tinto Zinc's work in Madagascar, for example, where they're destroying an area of biodiversity, you have an offset regime set up there, and then it can be everything from BirdLife International, Kew Gardens. They all get they all get financial streams out of that, and then you get this very perverse situation where the value of your environment that you're supposed to be protecting, its economic value is dependent on somebody else destroying it. You get a real perverse asset class. Right. So I think, unfortunately, environmental organizations are also becoming more and more embedded in this whole regime. I don't know if you want to add something, Ian, to that, or Sarah.
Well, I mean, I'd confirm that. I mean, I think there are lots of NGOs and wildlife charities and organizations like that who are looking at this approach in a very uncritical way. And unfortunately, in the circumstances, I mean, after 10 years of economic crisis and now COVID, I suspect there's a lot of pressure really for them to think about the bottom line more and more. And it's also interesting how much it crops up in campaigning. I mean, I was involved when I was at Gwent Wildlife Trust with a long campaign against building a motorway through the Gwent levels. And we had lots and lots of consultants and others coming to us offering to give us an economic valuation for this entire wonderful landscape. And we just kept saying, no, it's literally priceless. I don't want to play a game where we establish a monetary value and then Welsh government turns around, or the developer turns around and says, okay, it's worth this much, that's how much we're going to give you, and you can go and produce it somewhere else. It's quite a dangerous and slippery slope, and as I say, surprisingly uncritical. I think if members of organizations knew that these sorts of things were going on, they asked some very probing questions of organizations that are supposed to be defending nature. That they would go through that process quite so easily and without critique.
Awesome, thank you both. And Sarah, I don't know if you had anything to add to that. If not, that's fine.
It's just, sorry, my video I was advised that my connection seems unstable, so I'm just keeping my video off.
No problem.
I don't have so much to add, to be honest. I guess I just want to note, and I think we'll be talking about it later on, about how it's become a mainstream approach of working with, biodiversity and conservation, and how it can, fall prey into greenwashing, and how it can also be used for the new language of sustainability, and how it can still use the same old economic model or ways. But it's something to be careful when we use it, and also that it takes a a large spectrum of sectors using the term differently, from the dark green to the light green movement. So just sharing that.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I guess the next question I would have, which we've sort of started to touch on, is now that we've established what natural capital is and who's promoting this kind of discourse, what are some of the potential issues with placing an economic value on nature? Ian, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say, I suppose, is that it can crowd out alternative valuations. And that sounds a bit dry, but what I mean is, if you think about why people value nature, monetary equivalence is probably the very last thing they'd consider. There's a whole series of reasons why we are attracted to nature, and a lot of them are to do with, they can be spiritual if you're that way inclined, or emotional, poetic, historical, cultural, there's a whole series of ways in which people connect to nature, and the problem with money is that it's not an objective valuation in capitalist society. It's very closely linked to power, and it's very hegemonic or dominant, if you like. So the minute you start valuing things in monetary terms, it can push out and crowd out all those other reasons like intrinsic worth and so on. So I think that's one of the main problems with it. And what it's doing in that respect is it's creating a version of the, if you like, the Tariq Ali's ideas of an extreme center within conservation and within environmentalism, because it's sort of saying, well, if it doesn't have any monetary value, it's not going to either be part of campaigning or part of policy or part of consideration. And I think that's a very dangerous situation to be in at this moment, because the extinction crisis is so very real. It also, and I think this is very relevant to the ORFC, it also completely ignores any valuations that aren't bourgeois, that aren't capitalist. So an intrinsic, an indigenous group that's interacted with nature for thousands of years, are they suddenly to be expected to have the economic value of that ecology presented to them, and that's supposed to save them from developers or the multinational corporations that are banging on the door? I mean, it's too mainstream in a way, is what I'm saying. It's a historical, it's a political, and it doesn't give us as campaigners or radicals who are trying to push for a better world, it doesn't give us enough purchase to produce that. And I know that it can be linked to ideas of circular economy and all those sorts of things, but what you noticed about the advocates is they don't talk about that stuff. They talk about the financial value of nature and biodiversity and offsetting and all those sorts of things, but they are still wedded and welded to the economic status quo. So there's no sense that they're actually going to use this critique of economics to shake up the entire system or change society. It's just a way, in effect, of commoditizing nature and pretending that we can just solve things through the market.
Yeah, those were all great points. Thank you, Ian. And Sarah, did you have anything to add to that from your own work with Green Relief?
Well, we work with, there's one particular story of a community where we work with. It's up in the north, and we were invited by the Department of Education to work on a permaculture project. And it was a year after a super typhoon. And so many of these farmers, indigenous farmers, have been recovering from the loss of their crops and damage to their ecosystems. And what we didn't understand before is that apart from the typhoon as disaster, there was also this disaster from rapid land conversion to Roundup ready corn, and the growth of just converting a lot of the land to all these cornfields, and with heavy glyphosate use, and there's also the conversion of old coffee trees that used to be the primary source of economy in the land. And they used to be the first coffee processing village in the province, where the trademark of that coffee of the province comes from. And for them to be cutting down their mature coffee trees, it takes years to grow, and to grow all these cornfields and replace their soils and ecosystems and forests with it. For me, that just an example of how when we lose the value of nature and put more economic value to it, leads them to a cycle of debt. That they're saying that the soil, as the soil degenerates, it yields less because of the glyphosate in soil and other chemicals in the soil. And apart from the disasters flattening down their monocropped cornfields, they end up in debt and also hunger. And and health problems with the runoff from the pesticides and herbicides going through their water. And so it affects a lot of the health, the well-being, and also the loss of their cultural values, where this village, this town has a lot of they have a lot of rituals and ways. They still have it. They still have their rice granaries, they have their harvest rituals, they even have rituals before they cut down their trees, and they still do that. But there's that, they're in that modernization and the keeping their traditional values on the line, so that also affects that. It's an issue that arises. Yeah, for me, I guess, sorry, I'm continuing to share from the experience from just working with the communities I work with. And yeah, it's very clear, but there's also, there may also be a good value to it once where they start valuing the how they restore the ecosystem. So this is where our work with building into shaded coffee and protecting and rejuvenating the mature coffee trees, and then building a demo site on permaculture and regenerative agriculture, and showing them that there are alternatives, that rather than cutting down your trees, you can have more long-term regeneration and have income, and linking with markets. I'll share more about it later, but just that creating a value also from the economic side also kind of might motivate them, because a lot of the drivers as well for them to destroy their ecological ecosystem is that it's economic need. And so yeah, so just sharing that as a story, and hopefully that conveys what my answer is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story with us, Sarah. It's interesting to hear it from kind of a practical perspective of what you've seen in your own work. So thank you for that. And John, from your perspective, do you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, no, I'll add a few things. I mean, there's three things I want to add. First of all, issues of justice, right? So there's a very straightforward problem that if you take willingness to pay, which is this kind of standard way in which you monetize these goods, willingness to pay is income dependent. The richer you are, the more you're willing to pay for a good, and so forth. So the value of money depends partly on how rich or poor you are. So all other things being equal, I mean, you see this with cost benefit analyses, that you put the road through an area where people are poorer rather than wealthier. The second injustice issue is that it can't capture the value of those goods for future generations and non-human beings. Right, so neither of them can express a preference in markets or through monetary valuation, and and you get that added to by once you start introducing the practice of discounting, that you actually discount future values compared to current values, you put less value on it. You start getting very clear intergenerational injustices. A second set, I'll come back to the third issue of justice in a moment, but a second issue for me is that it's reason blind. That is, it doesn't make our decisions about environments that matter, about landscapes that matter, doesn't make them answer to public deliberation. Rather, they answer to private consumer choices. And it's just the intensity of your preferences that counts. It's not how good the reasons are for it. So it treats, a landscape the same way as you treat buying or selling a piece of ice cream, right? Which one do you prefer? Right, that's that. The third one is that and it's one that Ian and Sarah have already mentioned, is that it can't capture the way that environments matter, parts of nature matter to different communities and individuals, and it treats those places as substitutable as well. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the failure to do that means that there's another form of justice, which is that other languages of valuation, other ways of valuing the landscape are silenced. So when we come to a public deliberation, they don't matter, right? They disappear from public view. And the only language that you can use is the language of monetary valuation. And again, it's a worry that the degree to which, because that's the case, you get various environmental organizations and NGOs think they have to use that language to be heard, but that just reproduces this silencing of other voices. And the final point related to that, and I'll stick a part of a quote up, which I'm going to read into the chat now, is one way of expressing the value of something is to refuse to put a price on it, right? So if I turn around to my partner and I say, "How much do you love me?" and I say, "Well, I love you so much it would take about £5,000 to leave you," right? She's not likely to be very enamored. And if I say, sorry, it's 20,000, I bet it too low, that's not gonna work either. The point is you express certain kind of values by refusing to price them. And I've got a quote here from a letter from a tribal village who were being destroyed by the Narmada Dam. And they were asked to take compensation. And he asked, what is the state compensating us for? For our land, our fields, the trees along our fields. We don't only live by this. Are you going to compensate us for our forest? And then as the quote goes on, are you going to compensate us for our great river, for her fish, her water, the vegetables that grow along her banks, for the joy of living beside her? What's the price of this? How are you compensating us for our fields? We didn't buy this land. Our forefathers cleared it and settled it. What is the price of our land, our gods, the support of those who are our kin? What price do you have on it for these? Our Adivasi life, what price do you put on it? The point about those rhetorical questions, what price do you put on it, is precisely the way that you express the value of that community and of that place as a place that embodies the life of that community, is refusing to put a price on it. And you get that running right through cost-benefit analyses and so forth. I mean, often you ask people their willingness to pay score, and they refuse, they protest, because that, as Ian has said in his words on this, is not the way that you can express that value. And in fact, you express the value by refusing to put a price on it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the next question I might direct to you first as well, John, because in your essay about natural capital, you kind of distinguish clearly between the issue of placing an economic value on nature and then the kind of separate but interdependent issue of privatizing and trading nature. So could you kind of clarify the difference between those two, and particularly for the latter one, privatizing and trading nature, what kind of issues does that pose?
Okay, so there is a distinction to be drawn. I mean, in the background of all of this is neoclassical economics. So they think, why have we got an environmental crisis? From their point of view, it's because those goods come free. They're not valued in markets. So you've got to put a value on them. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can either put a shadow price on it. You can work out what people would pay for it if there was a market, or you can set up a market. And what's increasingly happening is in the sphere of biodiversity protection and nature protection is the idea that we can actually use actual markets to protect nature and protect nature in the most efficient way. And you've got this way behind these no net loss or net gain policies. And you find that, the major instrument here is offset markets. And I'll just say a little bit, and there's lots of other markets. We could talk about carbon markets and so on. I'll say a little bit about offset markets. So offset markets, what you do is you take an environmental organization or a landowner enhances some area. They gain a credit for that. When then a developer is going to destroy another area, right? They can then destroy it because they can buy the credits from the enhanced area, and there's no net loss or even net gain. And the idea is then you can use markets to most effectively protect nature and produce a gain in biodiversity rather than a loss. And I think there's deep problems with that whole approach. I mean, which I'll say a few things about it now. I mean, one is it doesn't capture the way that nature matters to people. And philosophically, I'm sorry, I'm going to introduce some Latin terms here, which I don't know. Philosophically, there's a distinction people draw between de re and dedicto valuations. So I'll give you this is going to be really bad. I'm going to tell you a bad joke and then explain a bad joke, which makes it even worse. So the bad joke is Zaza. There's an interview with Zaza Gabor, and he asks, she says, people think I'm just a socialite. I do nothing good, but I found a way of keeping my husband healthy and young forever. And he says, well, that's amazing. How do you do that? That's great. He says, I get a new one every 5 years. Right. The point about that's a bad joke. The point about it is that we expect her to be valuing a particular person, her husband, right? Yeah. And about that person's youthfulness. What actually it turns out is all that she's concerned about, whoever young and whoever her husband is, who falls under the description of being her husband, that they're young and healthy. So de res, you're concerned about a particular thing, a particular person, a particular object. Dedicto, it just falls under a description. Biodiversity offsetting, and the offsetting regimes treat everything as dedicto, right? It's as long as another somewhere else has the same properties, you can substitute it. Even if you do that, there's still real issues about what level of description you use. So if you have a very specific description of a site of biodiversity, it's very difficult to substitute another one. If you have a very general one, it's very easy, right? And that's what's tending to happen. You use a notion of equivalence, which makes it very easy to replace one place with another. However, that doesn't capture the way that particular places, like that Namada case that I've just been talking about there, it's that particular place which embodies their community, their way of life, everything about which makes them that community. It's that they're concerned about. It's that particular. And saying that it's okay, we're going to create another area of biodiversity somewhere else isn't going to substitute for that. And that's, giving you an Armada case. I've seen the same thing there's another area of this, is just there's a straightforward injustice. If it's a loss of that place, then those groups lose and somebody else might gain. And I've seen that in, where I've been working in Manchester. There's people turn around and say, you're going to lose this area. But don't worry, because we've got a net gain policy in Manchester. Well, that's no benefit to in one case of quite a poor community who was suffering the loss of a really important natural asset, to say it's great, we're going to create an area of biodiversity elsewhere. And you haven't got that equivalence. And the third thing I've already mentioned, I'll just say it creates this really perverse asset class. Right, yeah. So the value of an offset, of an area of land as an offset, depends on you destroying somewhere else. Right, yeah. And then it provides this income stream to environmental organizations find themselves sucked into this world in which they have to, their income depends bizarrely, to defend nature, bizarrely depends on the destruction of nature elsewhere. There's lots more I could say, but I'll stop there.
That was great. Thank you so much. Ian, do you have anything to add to that?
There's a couple of things to add, I suppose. One is, if we go back to looking at what one of the foundational myths of natural capital is, it's Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons, which is an idea that a geographer put forward, that if you leave a commons open to people, then in a culture of individualism, it'll be destroyed, because people don't have any sort of control over it, or any controlling mechanisms that are market-based and therefore balanced and everything else. And it's used time and time again. If you look at all of the natural capital literature, from Dieter Helm, who's just been given a knighthood for service to natural capital, right through to people like Tony Juniper, and lots of the Western environmental movements use that particular theory or hypothesis at the base of their kind of inadvertent, in some cases, advocacy of privatization. But it's a lie. It's a libel on humanity. There's never been a commons or common set of resources that have been unmanaged. They're all managed and have been managed through very sophisticated cultural practices to maintain, if you like, the replication of their culture or their social reproduction. So their entire sort of philosophical basis on the tragedy of the commons is questionable, and that's the first thing to say, because it's just assumed that Hardin's tragedy of the commons is real, just like it was assumed that Malthus's ideas are real. They're not. These are ideological arguments put forward that lead to particular outcomes that favor a particular model of society that happens to be the one that dominates everything. So that's the first thing to say. Is we can critique that and just say that's not acceptable. Indigenous people, agroecologists, peasants, even farmers locked within capitalism and capitalist agriculture manage the land and their commons in ways that are agreed through cooperation and coordination. It's not a race to the bottom of individualistic desire causing destruction. So we can knock that on the head. The other brief thing to say is that we have to understand where a lot of the force for privatization comes from. It comes from the international architecture of neoliberalism. It comes from World Bank, the IMF, Bretton Woods institutions. It comes from Western governments who enforce those economic conditionalities on the global south through debt crises, and we will almost certainly see one of those coming out on the back of COVID, because there's an absolute refusal to entertain any international justice off the back of this terrible pandemic. And natural capital, unfortunately, is going to be one of the things in the mix this time around. So the chances are we will see people being pushed off their land or being bought out of important biodiversity areas where their relationship as human communities to biodiversity is exactly the reason why they're so wonderful, by the very simplistic approach towards land privatization and the kind of approach that NGOs take, or environmental NGOs and big NGOs take, which is that what we need is preserved land, protected areas, rewilding, and all those sorts of things. So there's the function of privatization in that mix is awful. It's more effective in a way than the gunboats of colonial power, because it stands above and dictates economic policy. And natural capital is part of that mix, unfortunately. And unless it's critiqued, it'll get in under the wire, and before we know it, we'll be fighting neoliberal environmentalists, in our struggles, as much as we're fighting neoliberal corporations.
That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Sarah, do you have anything to add to this question as well?
No.
Oh, what was that? Sorry.
No, thank you.
Oh, okay, no problem. All right, well, that was a very thorough overview of some of the issues with natural capital. So I guess to move in kind of a more hopeful direction, I would love to hear your perspectives on what is the alternative to this kind of a framework. And in particular, a subset of that question would be, how does agroecology and regenerative agriculture fit into the kinds of solutions that you're envisioning? So Ian, do you want to kick us off for that one?
Yeah, sorry. Well, I mean, the first and obvious one is exactly what we're doing now, which is get together with, like-minded people who care about more than just money, and work as a network to critique and to fight back against these things. And I think that's probably the most important thing. And in particular, connect and strengthen the tendrils of solidarity between groups that get split out by this. So, but let's connect the urban working class to their green spaces in the way that means they defend them against offsetting and that kind of stuff, the sort of thing that John talked about in Manchester, we see everywhere in urban areas. And let's connect, progressive farmers in the West with, the modern peasantry in the global South, and people who are undertaking agroecology. Let's defend them. Let's start fighting back a little bit. And so there's a resistance through activism and through solidarity that holds the key, the political key to pushing back against this. And it won't be easy, because unfortunately, as I said, I think we'll probably end up having to see some of the the arguments, the simplistic arguments for rewilding and environmental NGOs as part of the problem, the way things are going. That rewilding is the flip side of natural capital in a way, because some people have seen it as cash by which they can then rewild pockets of land, and a lot of it's depending on agricultural crisis and people losing their livelihoods. So there's lots to think about there. I think that's what we need to do is work for positive reforms. I mean, I live in Wales. We've got a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, which means that all public bodies must attend to sustainability. I mean, that's made an amazing difference to our arguments on the ground, and it's something that we need to be mindful of. I mean, we beat the M4 motorway relief road suggestions partly because of we had that legislation in place, but also because we were then able to connect that to Extinction Rebellion, and also because we made a principled position as conservation ecologists not to sit down and say, well, we'll take money, or we'll think about how much it's worth financially and that kind of stuff. So the means are out there, but they're just the traditional means of resistance. And what agroecology offers is, if you think about what's driving the biodiversity crisis, the main force it is agricultural intensification, is monoculture, is all of the artificial inputs that are put in by capitalistic ecology, and agroecology offers seeds of hope for an alternative approach. I mean, many indigenous groups and other traditional farmers would probably just laugh at us to say, well, of course you work with nature, not against it. I mean, that's that's quite obvious that you do that. And if we can get together, with practitioners, serious activists, indigenous groups, and everybody, and maintain solidarity going forward, which actually is the purpose of things like the College for Real Farming that we're developing, is to maintain that, that process going forward, then we've got a stronger chance of pushing back. But it's not going to be easy, and we are entering a difficult period when the financial powers and neoliberalism. They're not looking at the pandemic and saying, "Oh, we were going in the wrong direction." They're looking at it and saying, "Actually, as a form of disaster capitalism, this is a chance for us to push our agenda even further." And that means the final destruction of the rainforests and all of those communities and that sort of stuff. We simply can't let that happen. We have to fight back, and it doesn't offer anything in terms of practical terms except solidarity, which is the fundamental practical element, political element to learn from it all.
That's great, thank you. Sarah, do you have anything to add on the solutions front, what an alternative framework might look like?
I guess it starts with a paradigm, the shift in paradigm, of course. I love this message from the Achuar people in Ecuador. They said it's about, you change the dream of the modern world. It's like, it's not about meeting we have to change the dream of, the industrial society, and how we have to reconnect back to nature and shift our paradigm. And in a very real experience, it's also how we could help support people in remembering and restoring the value of nature. And like, for example, in our work, we work with permaculture primarily by integrate, ways that we could integrate regen ag. It's just all the same anyway somehow. The components of the nature-based solution in it. But like, for example, being able to help them see that by learning more nature-based solutions, like in the same village that we work with, we do a demo site on regen ag and permaculture to help counter the continued degradation of their ecosystem through growing of Roundup Ready corn and use of glyphosate. We show them, like, for example, one indigenous leader that we trained, she's now earning much more than she used to, because now she has more permaculture knowledge. She has permaculture knowledge compared to other farmers. And so just to show these things, that there's more value if you know more how to work with nature, and also where they could save, rather than just also have generation of income. So looking at savings and changing the paradigm of capital, looking at, of course, as I think it's permaculture, Bill Mollison, who inspires us to look at the 8 forms of capital, that something that's beyond financial. And also in our experience, I'm sorry, I keep on coming back to this village, because this is where we're really like developing our framework and approach. And while because the reality there is that they do need to revive their economy and livelihoods, because what used to happen, apart because of the rapid GMO corn production, has arisen from the drop in coffee prices, and in because of the integration of big development where multinationals have been bridged and invested, and because of competition, it has like the price became challenging, and then it also caused a lot of social cohesion problems and mistrust that projects failed there. And that's why and where we are hoping to restore the economy, contributing to the provincial coffee provincial coffee council's strategy of the whole province, is to revive the industry by showing agroecological solutions, but also like meeting, so like with the Department of Trade and Industry, we prototyped a participatory value chain mapping where we engage the indigenous leaders to start like documenting their own ecosystem and the high value crops, but also try to integrate, although we're still hoping to add this component of integrate biodiversity and how they could look that there's value with their traditional rice and indigenous rice and the different varieties that they have, so that they could start documenting that in a value chain mapping, but also to shift the paradigm from value chain to value web, just to change the perspective that we're not looking at it as a from the old paradigm of economy of linear chain metaphor. And so the idea of creating a web and ecosystem where we also plan to bridge with regenerative markets. And this is where we meet our work on creating multi-stakeholder ecosystems where the government, business, and civil society work together. But also in the heart of it, in the middle, are the local leaderships that we are helping enable. So, and not just talking about leaders like they are just appointed by the government as government officials, but leaders, leaders who have the potential to influence and inspire the community, and the early adapters who also are wanting to committed to promoting nature-based solutions. And from that multi-stakeholder collaboration, there's a deep scaling. So we're not just scaling the best practices of what's being done, in the policy level, and then to also replicate it as many people doing it, but deep scaling of relationships. And apart from this, we're also developing a project called Living Story Landscapes, where I'm an artist, so I try to bridge my community arts practice and working with indigenous people. So we're bringing in creative tools to help them make visible or to document their traditional ecological knowledge through art, film, videos, so that they also start documenting the stories in terms of their crops or their ecosystem, so that they don't forget that, because while we're trying to bridge regenerative markets to them, we're also communicating to them that that there's a risk when you start promoting livelihoods or economic gain, because you start losing the value of your cultural heritage and the value of your the land. And so by creating ways that they could reconnect to that and create value to that and create an audience as well, where people start valuing it with them through their films and stories of the food that they eat, the story of their medicine and their rituals and all these things. So we combine that by working on the participatory value chain design and a value web design, and the multi-stakeholder platform, the documentation of traditional ecological knowledge. And that, for us, like trying to combine those elements, a holistic paradigm. And one closest paradigm that I, because I'm with the Eco-Village network as well, the movement, and we work with the socioeconomic, ecological, and cultural dimensions, and they're designing them all together, making sure that the economic dimension doesn't supersede the design of community development plans. And there's also one framework we're working with Common Lands for Returns framework, because they're trying to bridge the language of valuing the natural capital and financial capital, and there's the 4 returns of the return of inspiration, of the sense of purpose of people, and the sense of, bringing community spirit with social return, the return of social capital, the return of economic capital, where, of course, the economic gains and financial return, but there's the ecological capital, the natural capital, where retention of water, sequestering carbon, promotion of biodiversity, and restoring degraded land, and all these things. So there's being able to just show a holistic paradigm and their interrelationship from a whole systems approach, I think, is a way as well to bring show alternatives to just looking at natural capital per se.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And it sounds like you're doing amazing work over there in terms of reviving community spirits and kind of moving towards this more transformative whole systems shift in thinking. So thank you for sharing that with us.
We're in a small way, by the way. I don't want to sound like we're high impact and all these things. Small, it's ongoing, it's developing, evolving, and we got halted by COVID, but just making sure that we're also being transparent, that it's a small scale. We're preparing to scale for now. So
no, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And John, do you have any comments to share on that front as well?
I'll just make a few brief comments to give the people time to do questions. I mean, first of all, I think just building from what we've already been talking about, there's importance of resistance, and in particular, insisting on the rich valuative language that we have to think about the environment, rather than to resist trying to reduce it to services, benefit streams, financialized, monetized, and marketized. So that's important. The second one, I'd just like to kind of add to Ian's point about the importance of solidarity, and that works across not just people that are losing the spaces, the green spaces that are being offset, but also what's happening on the other side, what's happening with the offset. And I've put a report up there about an offset regime in Madagascar, where what you found was that BirdLife International had taken the money to get the offset. The offset involved taking a group of a quite poor community who lived off the forest and excluding them from the forest. So you had a double injustice, right, that's going on from something of that kind. And it's really, I would recommend people look at that. So people were losing their source of food, right, their source of where they could grow crops and so forth. And it's related to Ian's worry about this rewilding, the idea that nature's only okay if it's got no people in it, right, rather than understanding the way that people can interact with nature. Third one is the importance of just public deliberation and public debate, and kind of resisting attempting to resolve all these problems through economic instruments and markets and market evaluation. The fourth one, just to repeat something that Ian said earlier on, but he didn't mention at the end, is the importance of commons and commoning. Right, so you have got this idea that's in the background that the commons were the source of the problem. I actually think it's the other way around. I think they're the source of, often they're the source of the solution. And finally, I mean, this is going to, as I said, it's in very abstract ways, and we could talk about it in more detail, is you really need an economy that responds to needs and use values, not the one that's just concerned with exchange values and markets and monetary values. So we have to think in a bigger way, I think, in terms of that, about what kind of economies we want, because part of the problem here is we're dominated by a global capitalist economy, and until we start questioning that, I think we can resist in various ways, but we've really got to start thinking about serious alternatives to that. So I'll finish on that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And we have a few minutes left, but in the meantime, if people have questions, feel free to just post them in the chat box, and we can post them to the panelists. Oh, we've got one coming up now. So the question is, do you know the food systems in the Grand Canyon? I'm starting a research piece on this and was just wondering if you had any knowledge around this. Do you think humans can love and nurture the earth without any kind of religious view, native or European? If anyone has a comment on that, feel free to answer. We don't have to go around everyone. But
can I just say one thing on the Grand Canyon? The answer is No, I don't think about it at all, so I can't help right briefly. On the thing about can you love and nurture the earth without any kind of religious view, native or European? The answer is I hope so, because as a good Catholic atheist, right, I do love nature in various ways. But there's a more general problem here, is that I think there's a worry sometimes when I hear people talk about indigenous communities and so forth, that everyone's got they treat them as all identical when there's lots of different kinds of communities. And I remember it being at the European Social Forum when it was in London, and there was an indigenous person from Peru stood up, and he said one of his main things that he wanted to do was rescue his culture from missionaries and anthropologists, and started his talk by saying, the first thing I want to do is I don't think anything is sacred, right? Yeah. And again, that was trying to say that actually the representation of their culture in terms of a particular concept of sacredness that comes from a Christian tradition might not actually be the proper one to understand what's going on in their culture. So I think generally we've got to be much more open to the diverse languages that people are using, and that can include religious for sure, but it's got to include good Catholic atheists like me, right? So.
Any other comments from the panelists on that one, or we can move to the next?
Well, no, I mean, I'd welcome any view that doesn't just financialize everything. Doesn't matter whether it's religious or humanist or whatever. I mean, you got to look at the lengths to which we're going crazy on this stuff at the minute. I mean, there was a report, the value of the Earth being calculated by a guy called Greg Laughlin, who's an assistant astronomy and astrophysicist at University of California, Santa Cruz. He estimated the value of the Earth as $15 quadrillion, which is 5 quadrillion. It's 5 with 15 zeros after it. Well, you know, there's no market in habitable planets, irrespective of the fantasies of Elon Musk and those other people. This is the only place we've got, and if all we do is care about money, there's only one place that's going to go, and that's a short, sharp Anthropocene with us not being involved in the future. So, you know, it just needs to be rejected, and any value except financial needs to be taken into account and discussed and put forward.
Great, thank you for your responses on that one. So another question from the audience is, how do you rate the forest garden movement in regards to expanding habitat? Open for anyone to respond.
Well, I think anything that's agroecological in that sense, so whether it's forest gardens or whether it's in my part of the world, pasture-fed livestock and those sorts of things, I think is good and welcome. I mean, the difficulty is that because the dominant forms of agriculture in, you know, are intensive agriculture, and that seemed to be profitable, a lot of our seeds of hope, which is things like forest gardening and agroecology and pasture-fed and all those sorts of things, are dispersed and not invested in. And that's again, it's an indication of what money is. Money is a form of power. It's not just a passive instrument, because if it was, we would be investing in things that guarantee that our society is historically viable. That's not what we're doing at the moment. We're investing vast amounts of money in things that are profitable and equally destructive. So I know it's only a general response, but I do think that something like forest agriculture is good and should be looked at properly and invested in and become, you know, seen as the rational approach that it is.
Great, thank you. Did either of the other panelists have comments on that one, or should we move to one more question? Okay. So it looks like we have quite a few questions coming in, so we will continue with the Zoom session. I think we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'll pose one more in this chat, and then we can move over to the Zoom room. So another question from the audience is, do you think a narrative or aspiration of re-indigeneity could be useful in, for example, the UK?
I would leave that answer UK at least.
Sorry.
What was that? Sorry, Sarah?
Oh, I'd leave that answer to the people from that part of the world.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you. I'm not quite sure what the question means, right? Yeah. So I'm not sure what re-indigenation would be. That's right.
We can always get some clarification in the Zoom. Yeah. All right. That sounds good. Well,
if I may just add, I think it could definitely be. It varies across the sectors you want to engage. So really understanding what the sector's language is and what their needs are, then you change the way you approach it and communicate it to them, and come from what is important to them, what is valuable to them. And I don't think indigeneity or indigenous, worldviews need to be like you have to be from the First Nations of your land in general, but just that being able to connect with that, of course, but being able to know as well, just find ways to reconnect with nature and with each other in your community can be a starting point. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful. Just adding.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I just add one thing? That it sometimes, I mean, the use of the word indigenous in the UK context can have some quite reactionary meanings as well, right? Yeah, because you have large immigrant communities here, right? And actually connecting those communities to the land and to what matters becomes really important, right? Yeah. So again, if I'm thinking about the urban environments that in Manchester that I know about, and the kind of urban gardens and so forth, I mean, a big issue in the UK is, and you see it actually if you go into the Lake District or not, our national parks are some of the most white areas that you can go into in the UK. And actually connecting immigrant communities and communities from outside the UK and with the land and why it matters to them when they come into it, it becomes really important, I think. So I think you've got to be careful about, that's why I wanted a clarification, you've got to be careful about how you use the language in different contexts, I think.
Great, thank you, Don. And with that, so I'm mindful of the time and don't want to keep the Crowdcast channel open too long, but it looks like the Zoom link has been posted in the session chat. So whoever would like to join us for a more informal discussion and for further Q&A, feel free to move over to the Zoom room and we'll see you in there. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.